Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part B. In sight, in mind, but far away in time. The Untold Stories of Ancient Jerusalem. Chapter 2. The Untold Story of the History of Jerusalem before its conquest under David. What did the authors of biblical history know about the Jerusalem that existed 100, 200, 300 and more years before their time? What did they know about the city before its conquest in the days of David? What did they know about the city's conquest under David, about its population before and after the conquest, or about the process of establishing itself as the capital of the kingdom of Judah? What did they know about the city and the temple that was built there in the days of Solomon? Did they have any written sources that they could have relied on to write these descriptions? How accurately did their descriptions match the reality of the ancient times they were describing? In this chapter, I will argue that all the descriptions of the ancient history of Jerusalem reflect issues that preoccupied the Jerusalem elite in the days of the Deuteronomistic historiographer, and in a significant number of cases reflect issues that preoccupied later generations during the exilic and post-exilic periods. The ancient pieces of information embedded in the text do not derive, in my opinion, from written sources, but from memory-bearing objects, places, and buildings known in Jerusalem in their later generations that reflected the memory of people and events from ancient times and were interpreted in later generation in a way that suited the authors. These memories were written down and established as history within the sequence of the historiographical description of Jerusalem and Judah. Administrative writing in Judah begins only a century or more after the days of the United Monarchy. No inscriptions by and about this United Monarchy have been found from its original period. And the archaeological findings from this period in Judah in general and in Jerusalem in particular indicate a much smaller and poorer city than the one described in the book of Samuel and in the book of Kings. Thus, it is highly doubtful that an entity that could be defined as a kingdom existed in Judah during that period. Rather, we may assume that the biblical authors who worked 300 years or more after this period had no written sources. The descriptions of Jerusalem of those distant days were based largely on the reality of the author's day, alongside oral sources and memories passed down by the residents of Jerusalem from generation to generation. Memory-bearing objects, places, and buildings are permanent fixture in changing demographic, political, and religious landscapes. Their memory is rooted in their very existence, and the interpretation, understanding, and usage of memory changes according to the needs and the desires of each generation. That is, the very existence of memory-bearing objects, buildings, and places for hundreds of years in Jerusalem preserved the memories associated with them and comprised the source of the stories that developed around them from ancient times. However, the meaning of these stories, their interpretation, and the way they were used changed through time. Moreover, different stories and interpretations may have existed simultaneously amongst different social and religious groups, regarding the same places, building, and objects. At a certain point, once these stories were written down, either by Deuteronomistic historians or by Jerusalemite writers who preceded them, they preserved one particular version that revolved around the place, object, or building that carried the ancient memory. This version was used for a literary, religious, political, or historiographical purpose that had motivated the writing of the story. Indeed, we must remember that the mere act of writing down a story which had been preserved orally in various circles actually altered the story that is based on that memory, sometimes foundationally so. Potentially, in an earlier or later period, the story may have been completely different. Therefore, the time in which the story was written down, the people who wrote it, the historiographic sequence in which it was placed, the purpose for which it was written, and the audience for which was intended are also of great importance. This means that historians must be very careful when they attempt to reconstruct ancient historical realities based on those memories. Recall that it is impossible to know these memories' degree of historical reliability, because from the moment the story was established, it became the memory accepted by the authors of the history who, for their own historiographical goals, tried to make it the memory accepted by the readers of their generation. We do not know if the memory in this form was accepted by all members of their own generation, or if alternative version existed among other circles lost to history. Therefore, the degree of historical reliability of the story is not as important as the way in which the writers used it and the message they wanted to convey through the story to their contemporaries many years after the era in which the historical event took place. What is clear is that to the authors of the story, this was the memory, and this is how things were transmitted into biblical history. In the eyes of the authors of the description of the biblical period, the days of the founding kings were designed as a historical high point. David, the founder of the dynasty and the one who conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital, and Solomon, who built the temple in Jerusalem, were seen as leaders of glorious age, the like of which no longer existed in Judah. Accordingly, the Jerusalem of that period was described as a large, strong, magnificent, and rich city. This description does not correspond to the archaeological reality, nor does it correspond to the gradual history development, the process of the gradual historical development that characterize the development of every city. As mentioned, the Jerusalem of the 10th century BCE was a strong fortress city, but small and poor, which ruled over a limited area in the center of the hill country of the land of Israel. The archaeological research testifies to the slow development process of Jerusalem. The small and modest city of the 10th century began to develop in the 9th century, grew gradually in the 8th century, and reached its peak of size and splendor in the 7th century BCE. During this period, the city's surroundings also grew and developed, and a large area of farms and villages formed around the city on a scale previously unequaled. The peak of Jerusalem's size and splendor actually came after the kingdom enslavement to Assyria in the last third of the 8th century BCE, and even more so after Sennacherib's campaign and the destruction of much of the periphery of the kingdom, when apparently a large population of refugees, mainly from the lowlands, arrived at and around Jerusalem. We will see and talk about this further in the next chapters. The assumption is that the authors of biblical historiography who lived in Jerusalem at the end of the days of the first temple, described the reality they knew in their days and reflected this reality looking back to the ancient times of the founding kings. The authors themselves assume that if this was the reality in their time, then surely at the time of the founding kings to whom an aura of greatness and wealth was attached, Jerusalem was even bigger, stronger, richer. That is, the reality of the era of writing was used as a basis for the historical description, and exaggeration was projected onto that distant days. In fact, these stories described a city that never existed. What can we actually infer about the reality within the biblical descriptions of Jerusalem on the eve of the conquest under David and during its conquest, and about what happened after that? In most descriptions in the book of Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, until its conquest by David, Jerusalem is mentioned as a foreign city. Is this a full reflection of reality? Was it true that until it was conquered, it was populated by foreigners, but after its conquest, the entire population of the city changed, as it was populated by members of the tribe of Judah? Did Jerusalem turn from being a Jebusite city where Jebusites live? And of course, one must ask here, who are the Jebusites anyway? Into a Judean city where the members of the tribe of Judah live? And if it did, then who is Araunah, the Jebusite, Aravna, the Jebusite, from whom David bought the threshing floor on which the future temple was built? And who is Uriah the Hittite, whose wife Bathsheba David saw bathing from the roof of his palace? And if this Uriah was Hittite, then who was Bathsheba, who in the future would be the mother of the next king, King Solomon, king of Israel? My assumption is that a few events in the history of Jerusalem have vague and sometimes contradictory traditions, where the only historical rule that united all this tradition is that until the conquest of Jerusalem by David, it was a foreign city inhabited by foreign people, Jebusites. As noted earlier, Jerusalem is not mentioned at all in the Pentateuch, with the exception of a few late hints that link the city to the days of Abraham, either in the allusion to the place of Mount Moriah in the story of the binding of Isaac, or in the story of Abraham's meeting with Melchizedek, king of Shalem, who, according to Genesis 14, verse 18, was a priest of God Most High. The name of the king of Jerusalem during the period of the conquest of the land relates to this. According to Joshua 10, Adoni Tzedek, the king of Jerusalem, was a driving force in the formulation of the alliance of the 5 kings of the south in their war against Joshua and the Israelites. In contrast to the other 4 kings, there is no description of the conquest of Jerusalem in Joshua chapter 12, probably because one of the basic anchors in the Deuteronomistic memory of Jerusalem is that the city remained foreign until its conquest by David, so Joshua couldn't conquest. It was impossible to tell of the city being conquered in the days of Joshua, just as it was impossible to defeat Jerusalem in the stories of the book of Judges. But according to the description in the book of Joshua, Adoni-Tzedek met his death together with the other 5 kings. In Joshua 12, verse 10, the king of Jerusalem is mentioned in the list of the king of the land whom the people of Israel defeated and took possession of their land. End of quote. The name Melchizedek, king of Shalem, who was the priest of the God Most High in the days of Abraham, and of Adoni-Tzedek, king of Jerusalem in the days of Joshua, are not accidental, and they had to have been connected to the priesthood of the Tzadokite family, Tzadok, in the Jerusalemite temple during the post-exilic period, at a time when there were no longer kings from the house of David in Jerusalem, and the priests look up to the leadership of Jerusalem. Tzadok, the son of Achituv, the father of this dynasty of priests, was one of the two priests mentioned in the days of David. Later, we'll deal with the second priest, Eviatar, who was expelled from the priesthood. Clues planted in the biblical text linked him to the family of Jeremiah, who was one of the priests in Anatot. We will further discuss Tzadok's place in the succession struggle between Solomon and Adoniah, after which Tzadok remained the only priest in the temple built in Jerusalem. The status of the members of this priestly family grew stronger during the post-exilic period, when in the absence of a king, the priests established their position as the leaders of the people. Clues to the antecedents of the family's control in ancient Jerusalem before its conquest in the days of David, whether in the form of Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, or the priest of God Most High, or in that of the pre-Davidic king of Jerusalem, Adoni-Tzedek, could have given the Tzadok family a grandeur of historical antecedents, and perhaps also legitimized and strengthened the claim to the throne of leadership in Jerusalem beyond the defined areas of the temple and cult in the city. In the list of tribal allotment in Joshua 15, Jerusalem is in the territory of the tribe of Benjamin, and the border between the tribe of Judah and Benjamin passes south of Jerusalem. Joshua 18, verse 28, mentions Yebus, that is Jerusalem, among the cities in the territory of the tribe of Benjamin, but an editor's note was added to the description of the boundaries of Judah's allotment in Joshua 15, verse 63, reads, I'm quoting, "But the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people of Judah, could not drive out. So the Jebusites dwell within the people of Judah at Jerusalem to this day." End of quote. Judges 1, verses 1 to 21, describe the conquest of the land by the tribe of Judah and notes, among other things, the war with Adoni-Bezek. According to verse 7, I'm quoting, "They brought him to Jerusalem and he died there." This is a strange comment in the context of the fact that Jerusalem had not yet been conquered by the Israelites, reminiscent of the comment in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 54, according to which immediately after he killed Goliath, David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. In this case as well, the description precedes the time when Jerusalem was conquered, when the city was still foreign and Jebusites live in it. In contrast to the comment in Joshua 15, verse 63, according to which the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people of Judah, could not drive out, so the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. Within the summary of the conquest of the tribe of Judah in Judges 1, verse 21, there is an almost identical verse, but one that blames the tribe of Benjamin. I'm quoting, "But the people of Benjamin didn't drive out the Jebusites who dwelt in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have dwelt with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day." These verses express, in my opinion, Judean and Benjaminite polemics. They express a very late view and are look back from later periods. But as will be discussed later, the rise of the tribe of Benjamin to greatness and leadership in Judah came as a result of, and only after, the destruction of Jerusalem at the hand of the Babylonians and the establishment of Mitzpah in the land of Benjamin as the capital of the Babylonian province in the exilic period in the 6th century BCE. There was no longer no other earlier period in the history of the hill country where it could be claimed that Jerusalem should belong to the allotment of Benjamin. And even later, when Jerusalem re-established its position and the cultic and political center of the Judean province under Persian rule, and the Benjaminite region gradually lost its status and importance, this claim could not be made. So it's only in a very short period that it could be made. I further argue that these conflicting claims and the various accusations regarding who conquered or didn't conquer Jerusalem and to which allotment the city belongs is part of the historical dialogue and polemic that developed during the days of the exilic and post-exilic periods and are not reflecting any early time in the history of Jerusalem. In my opinion, this description could not have been written prior to this period of time, which was later than the days of the writing of the first Deuteronomistic composition, the DTR1, that was created at the end of the first temple. The meaning of it is that this is a late addition to the Deuteronomistic composition. The description of the physical location of the city and its foreignness attest to the marginalization of Jerusalem in the period that preceded its conquest by David, and perhaps also its marginality as claimed in the story of the Levite concubine in Judges 19 to 21. Throughout this long and detailed story, the location of the city is emphasized as being off of the main road between Bethlehem and Mount Ephraim, and as being inhabited by foreigners. There is no hint in the story about its holiness and what it would become after its conquest by David. As Judges 19, 10 to 12 describes, after the man leaves late towards the evening on his way from Bethlehem to Mount Ephraim, and I'm quoting, he rose up and departed and arrived opposite Yevus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled asses, and his concubine was with him. When they were near Yevus, the day was far spent, and the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." And his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah." End of quote. Who were those ancient Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem? The ethnic name appears in almost all lists of people of Canaan, usually as the last people among the 6 or 7 ancient peoples of Canaan, apparently due to the fact that it was the last group to be conquered and subdued. The Jebusites are mentioned as one of the peoples of Canaan 40 times in the Hebrew Bible, and only in 4 cases is place name Yevus mentioned there. Twice in the story of the Levite's concubine in Judges 19 verses 10 and 11, and twice in 1 Chronicles 11 verses 4 and 5 in its late version for the description of the conquest of Jerusalem. In all 4 cases, it is another name for Jerusalem, Yevus, that is Jerusalem, which does not stand on its own. And all of these cases involve descriptions that were written later during the post-exilic period, apparently based on the appearance of the Jebusites in the list of people in Canaan, and from the knowledge that they were the inhabitants of Jerusalem before it was conquered by David. That is, there is no ancient memory of another name that Jerusalem had, and the name Yevus was derived in very few cases written in later periods and based on the name of the ancient inhabitants of the city before it was conquered by David. In the story of David's conquest of Jerusalem in the 2nd book of Samuel, chapter 5, we will discuss it in the next chapter, the Jebusites are described as Jebusites the inhabitants of the land, in verse 6, that is, as part of the original inhabitants of Canaan. After the conquest of Jerusalem, we hear nothing of the fate that befell the Jebusites, and the lack of any reference to this population is special and different from many other biblical stories of conquest, including stories about David's conquests in wars with Israel's neighbors. That's, for example, in the second book of Samuel, chapter 8, there is an extensive reference to many of the nations that David defeated in wars, including large-scale acts of killing. The same occur in the second book of Samuel 12, verse 31. After the victory over the Ammonites, against this background, the text silence about the fate of the Jebusites after the conquest of Jerusalem seems significant and intentional. This silence fits with the presence of Uriah the Hittite and his wife Bathsheba in Jerusalem, as well as with the presence of Araunah the Jebusite as one of the residents of the city, and David's purchase of his threshing floor in order to build an altar there, according to 2nd book of Samuel 24, verses 18 to 25, at the place where the temple would later be built by Solomon. Additional support for the memory of the Jebusites being part of the tribe of Judah is found in Zechariah chapter 9 verse 7, stating that, I'm quoting, "It shall be like a clan in Judah, and Ekron shall be like the Jebusites." To summarize, it was probably well known that different groups of people had existed in the hill country of Judah in general and in Jerusalem in particular, and that they remained on the land after the establishment of the kingdom of Judah and became an integral part of the population of Jerusalem and its adjacent areas. At different periods in history, these groups were defined in different ways, depending on the purpose of the historical descriptions and the changing definitions of who is considered a Judahite and who is not. Thus, some of these groups, including the Gibeonites living north of Jerusalem and the Jebusites who lived in and around the city, were also defined at various stages as foreigners. This is just one of many examples that for long periods in the history of Judah, there was no clear definition regarding the belonging of different groups to Judah and Israel, and this definition also changed a lot over the generation. The next chapter focuses on the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem, and I will try to reconstruct the origin of the traditions regarding the city's conquest by David.